Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, China has become the epitome of fool me once. And by this, I mean that each time a nation or institution uses them for a purpose, China immediately forges new alternatives where they no longer need to be in a position to be reliant upon anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an interesting discussion because it will dispel a lot of myths. It will give people background that perhaps they're not aware of. I mean, these have been, I've discussed it in my own podcast in the past, but I think the important point to make with this is, and it's something a lot of Americans do not understand, is the United States is very dependent on China. China is absolutely not dependent on the United States. There's this big myth that, well, if China stops exporting to the US, it will collapse. Well, we'll come on to that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to put some background on this because it is also not well understood that in 2008, when we had the Western financial crisis, what happened is it was the Chinese that bailed out the United States. And people often complain that, China abused the relationship between the US and itself when it was admitted to the World Trade Organization in 2001. And basically, it became a country that was supplying cheap goods to the United States, which is true. But here's the big thing. What was the one thing China did in return? It would always buy up enormous amounts of US debt, and there was never a problem with that. So basically, the United States got a lot of cheap goods, and in return, China got a bunch of worthless bits of paper called US treasuries. Now, where the problems began, excuse me, to materialize was in the aftermath of 2008, when China, of course, bailed out the US and the West. But here's the problem. The United States then decided, in its infinite wisdom, to start printing enormous amounts of money, basically QE. China was furious about this because their attitude was, look, we've had this reciprocal relationship. Now you've just gone off piste, printing huge amounts of money. And that basically devalues the dollar and it damages our treasury holdings, and we're not very happy about it. And that started to put certain doubts in the minds of the Chinese. The thing that really cemented that perspective was, ironically, the Ukraine war in 2014, hence why China and Russia signed the massive energy deal for the Power of Siberia 1 gas pipeline, which was all conducted in non-dollar terms, so it accelerated de-dollarization, but also in the process of doing that, it also was the catalyst for China to stop effectively buying US treasuries. And then there was this slow process of getting out of US treasuries and wanting to de-dollarize simply on the basis that China felt, look, we can't trust the United States anymore. They're not honorable. We had an agreement. And then they came on and stabbed us in the back. And of course, things spiraled out of control during Trump 1.0, when at first it seemed like Trump had listened to the right people. He rolled out the red carpet, literally, for Xi and his wife in Florida. Very quickly, that relationship started to evaporate. And then in Trump 1.0, the United States tried and failed miserably to implement a trade war with China. And at that point, of course, China had long since began to slowly decouple from the United States, but more, it was growing its business relations with the Asian countries, with Africa, even to an extent with the Europeans. And there was this slow progress towards decoupling from the United States. And now we can see that very measurably. And if we look at the August data, the one thing that's very striking is China's exports grew 8.4%. Its imports grew 7.3 or 7.4%, but its exports to the United States cratered. I think it fell 27%. Now, this again just reflects upon the reality that China is diversifying its export markets to the ASEAN countries even more, to even South Korea, Japan, etc. But the big kicker is they're just decoupling very rapidly from the United States because it no longer trusts the US. And this is something else Americans don't understand. And this is a huge problem for the US for one reason. If you are going to decouple as a manufacturer or an exporter, then you have to have alternative markets. The problem the US has is it doesn't have alternative markets. And therefore, if China completely decouples and no no Chinese exports were to be sent to the United States, what does the United States do as an alternative? And therefore, it starts to suffer from a huge inflationary depression because it's not able to consume the cheap goods it needs to. And that's why people can moan and complain about the relationship. But it was actually hugely beneficial to the US to have cheap goods because, of course, as everyone knows and understands, the United States cannot produce goods for the same price. Whatever people like to think, we've discussed this before, it is far too expensive for them to do so. It's going to cost them 3, 4, 5, 10 times. That creates huge price inflation. And it makes the United States as domestically becomes completely untenable. And that is not something, again, people seem to understand. I'm not talking about people listening here. I'm just talking in the broader US population just doesn't grasp the gravity of the problems this trade war and these tariffs are having on the United States itself. Now, we've put out other YouTube clips talking about the mathematical impossibility of that. I would advise you to go and listen to that rather than us regurgitating all that information, because there are other more important things we can address today, which is in keeping with why the US is capitulating every 5 minutes with the Chinese, because someone suddenly has realized they're in no position whatsoever to dictate the terms of how that relationship works. And they should also not forget that, finally, before I pass over to Ken, that during the Biden administration, on at least 2 occasions, the US went with a begging bowl asking China to buy $500 billion of US treasuries. They said, sorry, it's not happening. It also happened during the Trump administration 2.0. They got told, sorry, we're not interested, because while you want us to do that, in the next breath, you're trying to undermine our economy and you're trying to get us to go to war with Taiwan. Do you really think we're that stupid? We're not going to tolerate your behavior. And this is the big difference. Russia is far more tolerant of the United States' indiscretions towards it. After all, the US is trying to destroy Russia with the Ukraine war, get rid of Putin, balkanize the country. And yet, okay, that was the Biden administration, but the Trump administration has not done an awful lot to stop that continuing to be the case. But they try to be forgiving. The Chinese are not like that. They're very pragmatic. And they will sit there and go, if that's your attitude and you want a war, an economic war, we will fight the war until we destroy you. We have no qualms about that. If you want to be friends and work peacefully and in mutual cooperation, we can have a great relationship. And I'm speaking from personal experience. I have worked with Chinese businesses. I have been in China. I know how this works, and I've had successful relations with these businesses because I know how the Chinese think, how you treat them, and how they treat us correspondingly. And it works brilliantly if you're prepared to behave like an adult and not to abuse the relationship and seek to try and put one over on them. Because if you try to do that, they will take very, very stern action to deal with that problem. And in the context of a business relationship I might have, it's over. The business relationship ceases immediately, and there's no second chances. So, I mean, that's not the nature of how I would do business, of course, but I'm just making the point to clarify why China has a very different perspective.
Yeah, and I think 2008 obviously was a major milestone where uh, patterns shift. But I think we need to go back just a little bit further to 1996, when after the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. government wasn't subsidizing the defense industry. The U.S. was in a recession coming out, so they needed an alternative for the company, the corporations, and cheap labor, of course, was the catalyst. So NAFTA and GATT were passed, and all of a sudden, a lot of the U.S. businesses that had previously been done domestically now were offshored. And really, this was the start, not the very beginning, but the start of the rise of China as a uh, exporter and industrial power to the magnitude it was today, or it is today. So with that happened, of course, the U.S., since it got rid of most of its actual productivity, its industry, it started putting money into things like the tech industry. We saw the dot-com bubble. Then, of course, even during the housing bubble, where that was the primary point of where revenues came from, in the stock markets, you had the rise of financialization. So the US was putting all of its money not into actual capital expenditures or to building industry, it was putting it into the Wall Street mechanism of financialization in the banking firms. What was China doing? China was building its industry, making goods. It still had a lesser cost of labor requirements, so they were able to, within a 20-year period, become the biggest exporter that the world has ever seen. Now, of course, China has moved just from simply the sweatshop of the world, forgive my French, but that's a good analogy, to now being the economic power that is on par with the United States. And it's kind of interesting because our friend Simon Mikhailovich, he put out a little post earlier today and said, China isn't an enemy of the US in the same way that digital photography wasn't an enemy of Kodak. They're simply competition where one chose the future and the other chose to live in the status quo or the past. And I think that's really a big delimiter between what China is and what the United States and Europe are.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point Simon makes. He's extremely erudite in his thoughts and feelings on things. And the thing I think is worth mentioning that confuses a lot of people because in the US, people think, as we said, that China totally depends on exports to the US. Well, the truth of the matter is, everyone massively, in that regard, those people underestimates the size of the domestic consumption in China. There's all this idea, oh, China doesn't consume very much. It consumes far more than people understand across all industries and sectors. If you look at those sectors that there you would say China has any dependence on with the United States, it's consumer electronics, but it's only 10% of revenue. With electrical equipment, it's probably about 5%. And all the rest, of which there's 20, 30 categories, it's insignificant compared to China's export revenues to other jurisdictions like the ASEAN, but also in terms of the revenues they generate domestically. And we're talking about everything. So automobiles, I'm not going to go through everything. There's machinery, there's clothing, there's pharmaceuticals, there's instruments and meters, there's non-ferrous metals, agricultural products, there's like textiles, fuel, etc., etc. There's a massive list. And the United States is nowhere to be seen on that list. So China could rightly cut off from the United States tomorrow, and it wouldn't make a scrap of difference to its GDP in any way, shape, or form. And that's why, for China to decouple from the United States is very easy to do. And it's also in its interest to do so because, as we said yesterday, how the Western financial system, how the dollar's performing, how fiat currencies are in the West due to financialization, where they've destroyed the purchasing power immensely, even though it was destroyed prior to 2008, but even more so since then. So there is no reason for China to continue this relationship, particularly if the United States is hell bent on trying to cripple them. And that comes back to, and we don't want to repeat ourselves too much from the other day, where obviously the United States has tried this trade war again. They've tried to cripple the likes of Huawei and failed. They're trying to stop China having access to semiconductors, and China is then doing its own thing and being extremely successful. But what did China do? As we said, came out and put these massive restrictions on any technology related to semiconductors, which, because indirectly it relates to rare earths, have magnets, and the United States just couldn't believe it. And they couldn't believe it because they didn't think China would do this. They should have learned the lesson that China will do anything if the United States is aggressive, they will put their foot hard down on the accelerator to cause the US immense damage. And this would cripple the United States if it carries on, because they couldn't then produce anything themselves. So cut China off from semiconductors. China goes, fine. You won't even be able to manufacture the semiconductors that you want to cut us off from, etc., etc. So the US, of course, comes out and tries to pretend it's in charge. And, oh, we had these discussions and basically trying to make out China was backing off. China doesn't even want to talk to the United States at the moment. And China's not backing off. They're saying it relates to industries associated with the military and defense, etc. But we're prepared to work in the commercial sector, as we've said. But we're not backing off from this. And we're only going to reach an agreement when you, as the United States, behave like adults instead of children with regards to our relationship. But it has shocked the US because they've realized increasingly how vulnerable they are without the Chinese. And they've realized China is already decoupling from things like soybeans, which they get from Brazil and not the United States anymore. And if the US wants to continue down this route, China will totally decouple from them. And you know what? I'll say this, and I wouldn't even put it past them to have very limited diplomatic discussions, just the bare minimum required for that relationship to function. And the rest of it, they'd say, forget it. We're not interested in the relationship. And this is why the US is now beginning to panic, but tries to portray the idea that they're still this hegemonic power. But the global South countries know full well that is absolute nonsense.
Also under the radar, people don't realize the simple but complex things that are being done to try to, in many ways, buy off potential nations that could move into the multipolar world that Russia, China, India are building. And that's one that stands out is Argentina. Recently, of course, the United States, Besant, created the swap line to buy their currency because it was devaluing. But in reality, we find out just a day or two later, now all of a sudden there's going to be an AI data center that's going to be put in there. So really, the U.S. is trying to buy and put pressure on a number of different countries that could potentially look towards China as an alternative to, and this is how the game is being played. So, more than anything, I think we're just starting to see some scratch the surface on what this battle is going to be. The multipolar world is like not quite an infant trying to burst through into the world, and the old status quo is trying to hold on with the unipolar world. But we are seeing these scraps, and you could almost compare it to the very tail end of the Cold War, where the U.S. makes these grand overtures of SDR or SDI and Star Wars, and we're going to do this. And Russia or the Soviet Union was at a certain point of internal collapse that it didn't take too much to push them over the edge. Now the shoes are on the other foot, where China is the one that has all the power, and the U.S. is desperately trying to do things to hold on. But every time they do, it shows to the world that they're so much of a paper tiger and they really don't have anything to offer but military and political pressure that over time, more and more and more of these countries, I think, are really going to move into the multipolar world camp.
Well, yeah, you mentioned Argentina. I mean, I mean, the US basically admitted, well, we had to get in first before China did. I mean, so it is. They're doing things because they were frightened China would have offered Argentina something to, and they would have then been in the China camp as they think everything's is basically a competition between us and China. The problem for Argentina is going to be it's not going to rectify anything. They can give them another 20 billion, another 20 billion. But the US thinks this gives them so that somehow they now are this creditor and therefore that gives us rights to start to have more influence over Argentina. But as I make the point on X, well, what happens if Milei gets booted out at the next election and some pro-China leader comes in and once tells the United States that's over? I mean, what are they going to do? Not allow it to happen? So the US can sit there and try to think that it's playing some great strategic game, but China's attitude is, in the end, what are you going to offer Argentina? In the end, the Argentinian people are not going to tolerate what the United States thinks it's going to do. And at some point, the US will have to leave with its proverbial tail between its legs, realizing once again that you cannot behave like an hegemonic power and you can't sit there and think, well, if we just give them a 20 billion swap line, the problems are dealt with. You're going to have to give them 200 billion, even then it won't work. And should ask the question, where's the money coming from? Well, it's printed money. So again, you're just debasing and destroying the credibility of the dollar in the process. And it's all to try and use the US thinks in containing China. So in their desire to thwart China, which it's not, they are causing themselves enormous problems economically, financially, but also in terms of their credibility. So this is another example in regards to this that the US has realized we are in serious trouble. They're not going to admit it with regards to the rare earths, magnets, etc., because China has put a policy in play that will cause us immense damage. But they're so desperate to convince the world that, well, we're dealing with it. We're having discussions and they're going to come to our way of thinking because we're America and this is how it works. And the world's looking at them going, don't be ridiculous. That's not how the world operates now. And the US just can quite easily have a great relationship with China, but the more the United States behaves irresponsibly and tries to stick it to China, so to speak, China is going to come back and cause them massive problems. And as I said, the Chinese will not tolerate this. They're not like the Russians, they're very different, clearly, and that's very obvious. But the United States needs to start wising up to the fact and stop trying to pretend and throw its weight around because China will have the answers in abundance. And because the United States depends on China, they can cause them huge problems, whereas the United States can't cause China any problems. And they can sit there and try to say China was attacking the world with this policy because they forget the world is called the global south. That's the world. They have this small microcosm that isn't the world anymore and doesn't have the clout or the significance, of course, it once had.
Yeah, whether it's increased port fees, reciprocal tariffs, or outright cutting the United States and Europe or whomever off completely from industrial or from exports. It's kind of funny. JD Vance came out on a tweet holding a deck of cards and said, "The U.S., when it comes to China, holds all the cards." But that was the ultimate of gaslighting. The reality is that China holds all the cards, and the U.S. had better come hat in hand, or pretty much they won't have anything to be able to lay on the table to play in this great game. Paul, was there any other final comments you wanted to add to this?
No, I think that's fine. I mean, we're just laying out again we're not here to do 2 and 3 hours about this. It's just to give people an understanding in very broad terms what's going on. Maybe in the future we will do longer things, but you know, it doesn't seem to work particularly well anymore to do this. There was a time when people lapped up those kind of length. Now people don't have the time for whatever reason. So doing 3 hours or 2 hours would probably be very detrimental. But obviously, I think we've presented the case very clearly.
Absolutely. We're as adaptable as we can get. To everybody here at the Sirius Report community, as always, thank you for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.